Last Monday was Indigenous Peoples Day, also known as Columbus Day. But in our Livingston County, unfortunately, the county government still refuses to call it Indigenous Peoples Day. When I taught religion and humanities at Truman College in Chicago, I always addressed Columbus Day with my classes. I would ask, who discovered America? At the beginning of my teaching tenure nearly 3 decades ago, lots of students would automatically say something like, Columbus! By the time I left teaching, folks were much more hesitant with their answers. Some would say Native Americans, or they might use the less accurate term Indians. And so then we would talk about the native tribes that would cross the Bering Strait into North America and South America and their history. And then I would ask them another question. I would say, who were the first Europeans in America? I would usually get an either Columbus or the Mayflower story. But then we would talk about the Viking era of North America. Greenland is in North America. Newfoundland, Baffin Island. Radiocarbon dating dates the artifacts from Viking or Norse settlements to the year about 1000 in North America. And a handful of Icelandic sagas describe Norse journeys to locations believed to be in coastal North America. So Europeans trying to colonize or settle in North America has a very long history, which brings us to our Unitarian history in North America. In 1620s, as you probably all well know, our Puritan ancestors begin to arrive in North America. They're escaping religious persecution in England. And those first settlers, their religion is called Puritans, but they quickly changed their name to Congregationalists because of the form of government that they had. They had democratic, self-ruling congregations that were not responsible to some bishop someplace else. That was a revolutionary idea on the religious spectrum. A couple of centuries later, the Unitarian and Trinitarian Congregationalists split. We then become the Unitarian Universalist Association and the United Church of Christ. In their first year, the Puritans survived because of Native American assistance. This becomes the American myth about the Mayflower and Plymouth Rock and the first Thanksgiving. We'll see all of those images appearing in the stores and on the media throughout the month of November. In today's political lingo, that means the Native Americans of this continent welcome and help undocumented immigrants survive here. Thank you. The Unitarian Universalist Association has formally apologized to the native tribes of this continent for the misdeeds of our religious ancestors. To mend historic wrongs, we actively seek to foster right relationships with the native peoples of the Americas. Towards these ends, we read our CUUB land acknowledgement statement as we did today. So those Puritan colonists developed democratic forms of civil and religious government. Each church elects its own leadership, just like we do, and it calls, and on rare occasion dismisses, its own ministers, just like we do today. This is in stark contrast to the Anglican Church or the Church of England, where a bishop has his hands, and it's always a male, involved in controlling the process somehow. Reflecting the times, though, only men could vote in our congregations. However, it wasn't that all men could vote. Only members of the church, only members of those Puritan congregational churches had the right to vote. And becoming a member of the church wasn't easy. You had to have a religious conversion experience. And then the church membership would scrutinize you and then vote if you could become a member and receive baptism and then have a vote. This complicated religious structure is codified in the Cambridge Platform of 1648. And anyone who attended Unitarian seminary would be able to recite Cambridge Platform of 1648 if someone woke them up in their sleep in the middle of the night. It's the foundational document on which Unitarian church governance is still based upon today. A generation later, the Halfway Covenant of 1662 makes a number of amendments to the Cambridge Platform. Most importantly, it opens up membership to members and their children, whether or not they have a religious conversion experience. And then modifications of the membership continue throughout history until the present day. Now, Chapter 17 of the Cambridge Platform has a very interesting clause in it. It affirms that the church may not interfere with civil government, nor the government with the church. Does that concept sound familiar to you somehow? This is from 1648. This is our ancestors in faith from 1648 talking about the separation of church and state. But their separation of church and state is not our separation of church and state. So here's the issue. If you were a member of the church, you were allowed to vote in the elections for the town council. Do you see something wrong with that? If you were not a member of the church, you couldn't participate in the municipal elections. That sort of puts a spin on this notion of separation in church and state. Furthermore, the Congregationalist churches in New England are subsidized by a church tax that everybody pays, whether or not you belong to the church. Now, we're not alone in this. Likewise, the southern colonies like Virginia, South Carolina also have a church tax, and that tax goes to the Anglican or Episcopal Church. Finally, colonial courts, the courts of the town council, not the church ones, conduct religious trials for such things as blasphemy, cursing God or saying that there is no God, heresy, false beliefs, specifically like those of the Anglicans, Catholics, Baptists, and Quakers, and those were their targeted groups, and adultery, such as Mr. Trump's past behavior. This is not our understanding of the separation of church and state. Historians argue that both Congregationalist New England and the Anglican Southern colonies were American theocracies, two different types of American theocracies where church and state were intertwined in so many and weird ways. So when you talk to people about the election, remind them that our country already had a theocracy. Not only one theocracy, we had two theocracies. And not only did we have two theocracies, we have two failed theocracies in our history. We got rid of them for good reason. And we're not going back. Now, these democratic ideas of those early Unitarians influence the principles of the United States of America, the democratic principles of the United States of America. Article 6 of our Constitution reads, and I quote, "No religious test shall be required to hold office under these United States," end quote. This refers to that earlier problem that we had in New England, where you had to be a church member in order to be able to vote or run for office or do other things outside of church in the larger body politic. And then, of course, we have the First Amendment of the Constitution. The first clause of it reads, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof," end quote. This is the separation of church and state clause of the First Amendment. This, of course, expands the earlier New England Congregationalist understanding of church and state. And it completely separates the two from being intertwined with each other. In the United States of America, after independence. In other words, Unitarians and Universalists have supported and continue to support an inclusive, expansive democracy that welcomes all people to participate in our democratic process. And we've done this many times in history in many different ways. I've got a few short examples. We worked for the abolition of slavery in our country and granting citizenship to formerly enslaved peoples so that they could vote. We worked for women's suffrage and the right of women to vote. In the civil rights era, we struggled against Jim Crow laws that prohibited people of color from voting so that they would gain the right to vote. We have worked to restore the right to vote to convicted felons who have served out their sentences. We have worked hard and still continue to work hard for women and trans people to make decisions about themselves and their own health care and their own bodies. That is a democratic principle, that you decide for yourself what you are going to do and not someone else telling you what you're going to do with your body. And we have worked hard and continue to work hard right now against voter intimidation and all these other means that are being taken to restrict access to voting by citizens in our own country. Side note, so last week I was at the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Retreat for the Heartland District, which is basically all of Michigan, all of Indiana, all of Kentucky, and parts of Ohio. And I discovered that half of us there, we're all registered to be poll chaplains in our various places. I'm going to be a poll chaplain on November 6th, on November 5th, whatever that Tuesday is, from in the afternoon in Flint, Michigan. I have an assigned polling location. I have an assigned clergy colleague who's going to be my buddy as a poll chaplain. And a whole bunch of other UU ministers are doing this apparently throughout our region. So today, in our new Shared Unitarian Universalist Values, and they're printed on an insert in your order of service, please take these home, study them. This is the new document that we came up with, the new statement that we came up with this summer. In that statement, we say, we support the use of inclusive democratic processes to make decisions within our congregations, our association, and society at large. This statement is a much more broad, much more expansive statement than the old fifth UUA principle. Now, these Shared Unitarian Universalist Values, as I mentioned, succeed the former UUA principles, purposes, and sources. They were changed this summer. So some of you might have noticed that these posters, several of which hung around the building, are missing. I took them down because we voted out the old principles and purposes and replaced them with the Shared Universalist Values, Unitarian Universalist Values. So I'm hoping some graphic designer will come up with a very beautiful layout for the statement that you have in your hands so we can frame it and hang it on our walls. And maybe the UUA swag office will do that for us. We'll see. Democracy is a foundational principle for Unitarian Universalism. We have learned that democracy can all too easily become the dictatorship of the majority. Democracy can all too easily become the bullhorn of white supremacy. Democracy can be reduced to enforcing political power over those who hold opposing views, and especially historically marginalized groups. Political scientists call such limited democracy, such failures of democracy, as competitive democracy. And we as Unitarian Universalists state that we believe in an inclusive democracy, not an exclusive one. We see a threat in our country today. We see a threat in these notions of exclusive and narrow democracies alive in the United States today. Laws that are passed against Black, Indigenous people of color, laws passed against the lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer communities, against the trans community, especially in their healthcare rights, against women, especially in their reproductive rights, against immigrants, and against those without economic privilege, do not reflect an inclusive democracy. They are vestiges of an oppressive democracy. Such discriminatory laws disregard the needs, the electoral power, the citizenship rights, the inalienable human rights of those people who are suppressed by such laws. We as Unitarian Universalists promote an inclusive democracy, not just the narrow concept of democracy in general. We seek a democracy that includes all people, hears all voices, and not excludes them. We seek a democracy that emancipates people from the structures of oppression that hold them down, political structures, economic structures, educational structures, and not a democracy that oppresses people. We seek what political science calls a deliberative democracy. A deliberative democracy includes a broad discussion process so that all perspectives of an issue are heard and discussed and explained for a deeper understanding. Not a discussion that devolves into a debate and us versus them argument. We seek a democracy that looks for a deeper understanding of all the issues that affect our country and the common good of all people. We seek ways to find an equitable solution to the challenges that our country, that our civil governments, that our democracy faces. We seek a democracy that serves society in the best and most expansive and inclusive way. That is our understanding of democracy. So, for example, we've changed the way that we Unitarian Universalists do General Assembly. Instead of all these delegates, hundreds of delegates coming together from all over the country and going to these business meetings, and then there's the two lines of the pro and the con, and they blah, 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 and then they take a vote. That would be an example of competitive democracy. That would be an example of the congressional form of democracy. We now have mini assemblies where the delegates are invited to come and talk about the issues that will be voted on so that everyone can have an exchange with each other to have a better, deeper understanding of what they are actually going to vote on, so that they could vote both from their conscience, but also vote reflecting the congregations that they are representing. It takes time to listen to each other. It takes time to hear each other. Remember when we had that circle maybe 4 or 5 months ago, where we sat in a circle and each of us had a chance to talk about our feelings about joys and concerns? That's an example of inclusive democracy in action. And then worship took those concerns and came up with a hybrid solution to meet those concerns. That's an example of deliberative democracy in action. So another thing that General Assembly has done is that the voting process at business meetings has changed. We still have to have, the two lines and stuff, but now we give historically marginalized groups priority to speak in those lines, so that people of color, so that women, other LGBTQ folks can have their voices heard, as well as the normal voices that you normally hear. The people who always have to get up and speak at the microphone, those voices, so that everyone can be heard. And then the delegates are reminded and asked not to vote on their personal wants or needs, but as a reminder that they are delegates representing a larger group of Unitarian Universalists in their various congregations, and that their votes are reflective of their congregations. That is an example of an inclusive, deliberative democracy. Now, some Unitarian Universalists like to call this process consensus. That's a misnomer. We still follow a democratic process, not a consensus one. There are consensus processes. And if you would like to learn about a consensus process, I would refer you to our Christian friends, the Quakers, who for 5 centuries have been working on consensus decision-making. We've been working for 5 centuries on democratic decision-making. Consensus is a valid process. It is another valid process. It is not the process that we have chosen as a denomination, though. We, as Unitarian Universalists, are growing into an inclusive democracy ourselves in our congregations and in our association, Unitarian Universalist Association. We are learning from our attempts and failures, our long history of the experiment with democracy. And we are seeking to develop a more expansive, a more inclusive, a more robust democracy for ourselves within Unitarian Universalism. But we realize that this experience isn't limited to our religious tradition. This experiment, this practice that we've been doing, this spiritual practice that we've been engaged with for 5 centuries, also can affect and help the United States of America, our country, because we want our country, which claims to be the bastion of democracy, to truly be a representative constitutional democracy, where citizens are free to vote without intimidation and without big lie conspiracy theories. When you go to the vote on November 6th, or if you go to the polls earlier on in early voting, or when you mail in your ballots, remember, one of the issues on the ballot this year, are we voting for the continuation of American democracy, or are we voting for what the others claim, a dictatorship that's going to happen in our country? It's up to us to choose, it's up to us to decide, and it's up to us to vote in a democratic manner, in a democratic process, to protect our American constitutional democracy at the polls. In how many days? Like in a couple of weeks already. Thank you.